Hi, Anthony. Really, I appreciate that you participate in this course about reptiles. We want to contact you and to ask you about what do you do. I really don't know what do you do because you do a lot of things. You do biomechanics, you do behavior, you do evolution, you do really a lot of things. What do you do? Which is your main interest?
Yes, for sure. I can give you a bit more background on what I would like to do. So my idea, that I've always been interested in, is to link the morphology of an animal, its form, with function, so what it does with its morphology, and to do this in an ecological and evolutionary context. So the idea is really to link up what an animal looks like, what it does with its morphology, and then interpret this in a comparative context, but also taking into account the ecology of the animal. Because really what I try to understand is the evolutionary pressures that have given rise to the diversity of phenotypes of morphology that we see. And some very good organisms to do this with are obviously reptiles. And so I've been working on reptiles for a long time.
But how do you choose a line of research? You choose a question and then you look for the animal or the system or the model to answer that question? Or on the contrary, you get an animal or an equipment and then you ask what question can be answered with that equipment, animal, etc.
So my approach has mostly been, I have a question, so something I'm really interested in, and I try to find the model group that is best suited to answer this question. And for example, if I'm interested in constraints, how the physical environment may constrain an animal, then for example, burrowing snakes, lizards, and amphibians are very good model systems because they are very much constrained by the physical environment they are living in. Another good group that I've worked on is like aquatic snakes, because water, just like soil, imposes very strong constraints on these animals, and so they have to deal with the physics of the environment. And so our question is, okay, how have they done this? And can we see morphological adaptations, functional adaptations that allow them to live in this environment that is especially constrained? On the other hand, if I'm looking, for example, to look at convergence, so animals that evolved in different contexts, the same morphologies in response to the same ecological pressures, anolis lizards would be a very good group to work with. And so because these anolis lizards have radiated on these different islands in the Caribbean, and on each island you see these animals that live in similar environments and have evolved similar morphologies. And so for that question, anolis lizards are a very good group. And so I've used both of these different groups, or all of these different groups, to answer different kinds of questions. So usually I will always go with the question that I'm really interested in, and then I find a group that I think is best to answer that question.
So you are a question-based research, but nevertheless, sometimes the techniques revolutions an area. And for that reason, I would like to ask you, in biomechanics, which is the state of the art, which is the fashion in which most of the research are done? The CT scan is one of that, the modeling, which is the state of the art in biomechanics or in form and function research?
Yeah, so in biomechanics, I would say that one thing that is really state-of-the-art, used a lot, is what we call X-ROM, so X-ray analysis of moving morphology. So basically using two X-ray systems to reconstruct in 3D the movement of the skeleton of the animal within its environment. And so this is a relatively recent, let's say the last 10, 15 years. The workflow, just all the informatics behind it, has become much more easy to use. And it's also tightly linked to, for example, CT scanning, because to do this kind of analysis, we have to put markers on the bones, we film the animal moving, and then we CT scan the same individual. We can do that alive in vivo, we don't have to kill it for it. And then we can reconstruct the bones of that animal and replace them based on the markers that we film in our X-ray videos. And because we have two angles of view in our X-ray videos, we can construct in 3D the complete movement of any skeletal animals that we want to look at, on the condition that it doesn't deform, because if the bone itself deforms, of course we can't reconstruct it. And so this is one of the really new ways of looking at biomechanics and especially movement in animals.
So that seems that requires a lot of artificial intelligence, and you are making mathematical models of animals. But do you test those models later on animals? So you go back to the animal, or because I'm feeling that those type of research apart you from the real animal. Is that true or not?
Yes, for sure. And I think one of the crucial elements in any kind of research, and this is also one of the reasons why I do a lot of field work, is to go back and validate any model that we make, because a model is only as good as the data you put into it. and always needs to be validated. So we can make very fancy models, be fluid dynamics, finite element. These are very much fashionable right now, but a lot of them are not so good. And so without a validation, proper test, we can't say anything. And so we have to go back to the animals, see what they are doing in their natural environment. And so one of the things that I've been doing the last 10, 15 years as well, quite a bit, is to take all my equipment to the field. Mm-hmm. So I have lots of transportable equipment. I have force plates, which are small but robust. So I can take them to the field. I can measure the animals in their natural behavior, in their natural conditions. We take high-speed cameras to the field. We take biforce transducers to the field. And so the more and more we take our equipment to the field to get better data of the animals that we're looking at. And the other advantage is, of course, that we can release the animals right after into the field and to have less of an impact on the natural environment.
And to move the laboratory to the field is quite difficult. The ecophysiology to maintain controlled conditions to be repeatable is quite difficult. So I understand that it's not an easy way to do the thing. It's much more easy to do in the laboratory. But sometimes those leads to a sentence like given a horse without friction, rounded and so on, and make a fantasy biology about the horse without friction and rounded and so on.
Exactly.
You told us the state of the art about the technology in biomechanics, but which are the most important questions that you have been in the morphology, in the vertebrate morphology Congress in Prague just now? Which are the most important questions? Which type of questions are scientists making nowadays?
I think personally, one of the most important and most interesting questions, there's two levels. One is really broad comparative analysis, mm-hmm. but that includes the whole diversity of taxa. For example, I saw some very nice talks and some very nice posters at the ICVM at the meeting where people were looking at cranial shape in salamanders, but they had measured, quantified the shape for more than 2/3 of the total diversity of these animals. And there was another talk on lizards, and again, the same thing. People had really quantified a large majority of the diversity. And so people are looking at how fast animals evolve. Do you see changes in the rate of evolution as animals change from one environment to another? So are there environmental pressures that drive rapid evolution, for example, of the cranium in snakes or in lizards, associated with different ecologies, different habitats, different diets? Can we link these kind of things? And so the other thing, yeah, go ahead.
So a comparative anatomy and evolution is doing again. The people is doing again, going back to the old-fashioned comparative anatomy in a broad sense, but
exactly.
with new approaches, new techniques.
New approaches, new techniques. And so the second element that I would say that's really important and which is being done more and more is to include also embryology into that. And so again, we go back to very old anatomy, finally, very old types of studies, but with modern techniques. We're following specific cell lineages, we're looking at how the skulls develop, and we try to understand also whether development itself can act as a facilitator or a constraint on diversification. Yeah.
So we have talked also with Ridiogo about Evo-Devo and the impact of Evo-Devo in nowadays science, so that's really important. Do you feel that you are working on Evo-Devo in that frame or not?
So me, myself, I don't. However, I'm very interested in the results from my colleagues. I've been involved in a couple of studies where we looked at morphology, looking at embryos and looking at adults, trying to understand what the trajectory is of shape change, of a morphological change, of functional change. But it's not my prime area of research. It's really more collaborative kind of work that I do. And then as a final really important question that we're addressing right now, I would say that one of the important things is to try and link microevolutionary change at the level of populations with changes at the macroevolutionary level. So what we really want to try to do is to link microevolutionary changes to macroevolutionary changes. So if you look at across phyla, across really large kind of genera, we see all these convergences, we see all these constraints, we see these links between form and function, which are very obvious. However, how do you create this variation in morphology, and what are the functional consequences of even small changes in morphology? And how can we link up these different kind of levels of variation? So small level variation, what is the impact on morphology? What is the impact on function and on survival of the animal and just fitness? And how do we link that to broader comparative changes in macroevolution? And so we've been doing, for example, a couple studies on lizards, where we have taken lizards, we've put them on islands, and we are following the populations of lizards through time. And we see very rapid changes in morphology, we see rapid changes in function, and we try to understand, okay, what are these kind of relationships? What is the ecological context that drives these changes? And the interesting thing is that the changes that we're seeing in these very short timescales, a couple generations at most, are on the same order of magnitude sometimes as we see between species.
Okay.
And so we see this link very naturally between micro and macroevolution.
And where are you doing that? Those experiments of islands?
So we do a lot of experiments in the Mediterranean, on the islands in Greece, for example, or in Croatia, because they're very good systems, because they have these lizard lizards, these small lizards that live there. They're very...
That's Podarcis? No, that's in Spain.
Podarcis, yeah. So Podarcis are all over the Mediterranean. So they go from Spain all the way to the east, so Greece and even the Central Asian area. So they're very common. They're on all islands, also the very small ones, and they're very easy to work with. So again, lizards are a very good model system to do these kind of questions, because we can catch every single individual, we mark them, all of them, and the next year we go back and we recapture everybody. And so
what type of traits do you follow? Size or what? What do you follow?
So we measure size, shape, bite force, sprint speed. We look at diet. We look at habitat use, thermal ecology. So there's a whole team of people coming together and really trying to measure as much as we can to take advantage of the system that we have.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned bite, and you are Mr. Bite, I guess, because you did a lot of bite studies in fishes, in mammals, in birds, and in reptiles.
Yeah.
Why do you pay attention so hard to bite? What is the thing that bite force and the mechanic of bite give to you the idea?
Yeah. So I think there's 2 or 3 things which are really, I think, important about bite force. One, it's a direct functional output of the jaw system. So if you think about the jaw system, lower jaw, the cranium, the muscles, and it's important to bite when you eat. So as you have to reduce prey, you take a big prey, you want to chew it up, take smaller parts of it. And so bite force obviously becomes something that's related to your morphology, but also to your ecology. It's also a very repeatable measure. So we can measure it today, we can measure it again in a week or in a year. We can see that animals maintain their bite forces very similarly. So it's a very good repeatable measure of a whole organism output of a very complex system, which is the jaw system. And then finally, it's also very important in 2 other contexts. When, for example, males are fighting or females are fighting over resources. For example, females can fight over good egg-laying spots in lizards, if they want to try good places to place their eggs. And males will fight over territories, over females. And so they also becomes very important to be a good biter. Mm-hmm. And then the final point where bite force may be also important is in defense. So if a predator comes towards you, for example, if you walk up to a big tupinambis, it's going to defend itself. And it's not so easy to capture it because it's going to try and bite you. Yes. And if it bites you, it hurts.
So there are a lot of functions with bites.
Exactly.
About that, we have been talking with Rui about an idea of GANs, that evolution goes to sufficiency, but not necessarily to efficiency. I don't know if I'm pronouncing well. Okay, and you usually measure the most hard bite that an animal can do, but usually the most hard bite is not what animals do in everyday life. Yeah. They bite in a sufficient way, even if he could do more efficiency. One thing is, why do you pay attention to the hardest bite? And the other thing that I would like to ask you is another idea that also for me is not for everybody, but for me came from Cargans, that any biological structure doesn't have only one function. So always is playing a lot of roles. So it cannot be absolutely efficient in one function because it has to have a secondary or tertiary option. For example, the tongue that you have to use to eat, but also to smell and also to talk in our case, etc. So it's suboptimal in all the function, but in all the function is enough for. If you have something to think about that.
Yeah, so definitely. So let me first get to your first point. Why do we measure maximal performance? And it could be bite force, it could be sprint speed, endurance capacity, jumping. It doesn't really matter. Like, we've measured all of these things in many different lizards or snakes or amphibians. The reason we measure maximal output is because there's two reasons. One is because it's going to be linked to the morphology, whereas submaximal is not necessary. I can bite, for example, 200 newtons, but I can also bite 150, 25. And so if I measure submaximal, it will not necessarily be related to my morphology, because you can always do submaximal. And so the link between morphology and performance, to really quantify that, what is the upper limit of what you can do with your morphology, we need to measure maximal bite force or maximal performance in general. So that's one reason. The second reason is, although most animals, like you say, on average don't use maximal performance, in cases where, for example, food is scarce, there's not a lot of food, like on our islands in the Mediterranean. They're very small islands. At the end of summer, there's not a lot of food available, and it will be the lizard that has the highest bite force and that can eat the couple hard or big food items that are still left that will survive to the next year. And so the selective advantage of these maximal performance peaks is going to be very high. And so that's why we see that most animals are actually overbuilt relative to what they do on an everyday basis. Because on an everyday basis, they don't use these maximal performance so much. But in extreme cases, for example, there's a very nice study also on Darwin's finches by de Grants, where they've shown that selection can be very strong on these islands, and it's the animals with the highest bite force that are able to crack the last remaining big seeds on the island, and that survive to the next year and transmit their genes to the next generation. So in some cases, maximal performance is really going to be what's determining your fitness. And on the other hand, maximal performance is directly related to the morphology of the animal. And so if we're interested in studying relationships between morphology and function, then we really want to understand this maximal capacity. But to come back to your second point, I think is very true, is that all what we see in an animal, its anatomy, is always the outcome of trade-offs. There is never a single function that an animal is using. It's always a compromised phenotype. For example, if we think about biting, about the jaws are important, of course, for biting, but they're integrated in the whole cranium. In the cranium, we also have the sensory organs, we have the brain, and so there's a limited amount of space. And so again, just having a bigger brain is going to have an impact on the size of your jaw muscles. Also in terms of energetics, brains are very expensive, muscles are very expensive, and it's difficult to do both. And so you have to allocate energy to different things. And so whether it be biomechanical trade-offs or energetic trade-offs, there's never a single optimum that you will see in any given structure. Animals are moreover constrained by their phylogenetic history. So they inherit the morphology from their ancestors, and given that their morphology they have, and given all the different functions that they have to execute with a given system, that's going to reflect the phenotype, the final phenotype of that organism. So that is for sure a very important point that we always have to take into account.
Good. What about the link between morphology and ecology? For example, you are talking about bite. Usually, we tend to link a specific morphology with a specific function and with a specific ecology or physiology, etc. But is that link really fixed? Is in the way that, for example, which is a paleontologist that said that the French one, that said, Cuvier, I think, give me a piece of bone and I will reconstruct all the animal, because they think that really they were fixed. Or how the plasticity of the system and the animals play in the everyday physiology of an animal.
Yeah, so there's two elements, I would say. One is, of course, the link between form and function is what it is, because it's driven by the physics and the biomechanics. So if you have bigger muscles, you can bite harder. If you have longer limbs, you can run faster. But however, it doesn't mean that there is not a filter between the performance and then the active selective pressures. For example, if you think about lizards living in open environments, desert environments. So desert environments, few hiding places, very open, so predators can see the lizard. So you would think that in this environment, a lizard would be benefited from running fast and having very long limbs. And so for most of the desert lizards, this is what we see. However, there's a few exceptions that are very short, and they're called phrynosoma lizards, very short limbs, and they don't run very fast. And it's because their behavior is different. And so the behavior is just to be cryptic, to be not seen by a predator. And so, of course, if you just rely on crypsis, you don't have to run fast. And so this idea of having this perfect link, if I know the bone, I know what the animal is doing, is not always true. Because if I would show you just the
there
bones,
are different solutions for the same problem.
Exactly. And behavior plays a very important role therein. And that's also why we often try to integrate also studies of behavior in our understanding of these kind of patterns, is because behavior can be an important filter between the performance of the system and then the selective value of the system. And so behavior is a really, really important trait that we really need to understand before we can make any arguments. And that's also the difficulty with paleontology. From paleontology, we have only the bones. We don't even have the muscles. So we can try to make some estimates of the functional output of these systems, but then we know nothing about the behavior. And so it becomes very difficult to make strong claims on what this animal was doing, what its ecological context was. And it's only by careful comparison with living taxa that we can get better ideas of what these fossil forms were doing.
Yeah.
And so there the comparison between paleontology and the link between paleontology and neontology becomes very important, of course.
Anthony, there are a lot of theories about the origin of the snake. There are a fight about that. Sometimes they said marine, others say terrestrial, so and so. And which is your idea about the origin of the snake? Which is the ecological origin of the snake?
Yeah, so we've been working a little bit on this question together with colleagues in different places, in different countries. And so what we've been doing is basically looking at the cranial shape as an indicator. To see, does the cranium tell us something about the origin or the ecological context in which snakes evolved? That's kind of the question we want to get at. Mm-hmm. And so, as you say, there's two main theories: aquatic origin, and that's mostly because the sister group to snakes is mosasaurs, and they were all aquatic. And so that gives a strong idea that maybe snakes were aquatic. On the other hand, if you look at the brain case of snakes, you see that the wall of the brain case is completely ossified. Mm-hmm. Most lizards don't have that. There's a membranous part, and so the brain is exposed. And so people have suggested that, well, if you burrow, if you push with your head into the soil, this is going to put a lot of force on your cranium, and you may want to reinforce the brain case, make it completely bony, to resist these forces from burrowing. And so if we look at other lizards that burrow, like Amphis bayonet, some other skinkids, you see that effectively the brain case is also completely ossified, or almost completely. And so this has always been a good indicator of a suggestion that maybe snakes went through a fossorial event in their origin somewhere. Yeah. And so these are the two main competing hypotheses. And so what we've been doing is basically looking at brain shape and also looking at ontogeny of cranial shape, to see if there's any indications on what we can say about the origin. And so if you quantify shape for a large enough panel of snakes, you can with some accuracy reconstruct the ancestral morphology. Yeah. So this is what we did with colleagues. We looked at a good sample of snakes, good sample of lizards, and we reconstructed the ancestral morphology of what we think is at the basis of snakes. And if you look at that,
it looked like the ancestral.
And it looks like the ancestor. And so if you compare it with living taxa, what we found is that this is not completely fossorial, but more leaf litter dwelling. So it is terrestrial, but close to being fossorial. You can imagine that it's like in the leaf litter, going under dead wood or stones and those kind of things.
Maybe like some angids or
exactly.
some phycodids or
exactly.
that are not exactly burrowing.
Exactly. So this is the idea. And so that's what's the morphology is telling us. Of course, we can only say something based on what we have now, the living taxa, on the phylogeny. And we know there's also a lot of debate about the phylogeny, where snakes are placed exactly, what are the sister taxa. And so this is also going to polarize our reconstruction of the ancestral state. So it's going to make a difference on how we can reconstruct the morphology of that ancestor. And based on the morphology, we are going to then infer its ecology. And so again, I think these approaches are very interesting, but we should never forget that there are also a lot of limitations to these kind of approaches. And so there's some insights that we can get from them. But of course, finding new fossils is going to be very important. And for example, we also did a study we haven't published yet, where we looked at the ears, so the semicircular canals of lots of snakes and lizards. And so finally, if you do that and you look at the ancestral morphology, it could be either aquatic or fossorial, because the ears or the inner ears in both groups are very similar. They are both very shallow, very large semicircular canals, flattened. And so both aquatic forms and terrestrial forms, in terms of middle ear, have very similar morphologies. And it kind of makes sense because they all have to live in 3D. Also, if you're burrowing, it's a 3D environment, just like water.
And water, yes.
And so your sense organs are adapted for both environments. And so it's very difficult to tease them apart. So I think it's a question for which we don't have the answer yet. I think we have some indications that a terrestrial epigeel or close intermediate form is probably more likely. But again, until we find some more fossils that are going to tell you something more about the exomorphology, it's going to be hard to know.
So evidence is not decisive for one or another scenario.
I think given the uncertainty that we have in the phylogenies and many other things, we cannot be decisive about.
Yeah, good. Nice the point. You did also a lot of work about gripping and locomotion. Okay, you did a lot of things in a lot of fields and a lot of, okay, I cannot follow you all, but with Virginia Abdallah and others, you were working on with Maria Jose Tulli that also are participating in this course. You did together some research about gripping. Yeah. What is important about gripping, the way that the reptiles, you did also in amphibians, but about reptiles, what is important about gripping?
So gripping in general, not even just in reptiles, is really important because it allows you access to a different habitat, the arboreal habitat, if you want to climb, and especially if you want to climb on narrow branches, small diameter branches. And this is usually where all the good things are, all the insects, all the flowers. And so you really want to get to those very narrow branches because there's lots of resources there. But if you want to do that, you have to be able to grip somehow. Because otherwise, if you're going to walk on a very narrow branch, you're going to have a tendency to roll. Yeah. And if you don't want to roll, you have to stabilize it. And the only way to stabilize it is to grip. Yeah. And so in lizards, which is, I mean, we've not looked at snakes so much, because snakes are also very good, of course, at going up on very narrow substrates, but they do it very differently. You know? So they don't really grip with their appendages because they don't have them. But in lizards, at least, there's two big ways you can grip. One is you can have adhesive structures, like anoles or like geckos, and then you can just, all you need is have some of the toe pads in line with the substrate, and you can pull on the substrate, and so that's going to create some stability on the substrate. However, neither anoles nor geckos are very good at gripping. They're not great, because they're also limited with this problem of roll, and their hands are not suited to do a grip like we can do it. So there's one group of lizards which is really good at gripping, and that's chameleons. And so we've been looking a lot at chameleons to understand how they grip, and if there is any variation in chameleons that are more terrestrial, because there are lots of them, and chameleons that are more arboreal. And so what we've been able to show, and this is also what I presented at the meeting last week, is that more terrestrial chameleons, their morphology is different of the hands, and also they're not as good at gripping substrates compared to more arboreal forms. And this is both for the hands as for the tail. So terrestrial chameleons have shorter tails, so they're also not as good at gripping with the tail. And so they're just not as good as moving on these very narrow substrates. So they have much more of a hard time to do that.
Good. And also you have similar approaches in several anoles or other groups that
yeah, but the big difference with anoles is that they can't grip like a chameleon. A chameleon has 2 toes and 3 toes, and it really has a pincer-like grip. And so it can do things that no other lizard can do. And so it can walk up much narrower substrates compared to any lizard that we've looked at.